When we're talking about movements of this time during the 18th century, we had Enlightenment. That was a movement that believed that humans were now entering a period when they were freed from religious dogmas and aristocracy, and that rationality and morality replaced those two systems of belief and human behavior and social structures. There was a great belief during the time of the Enlightenment in the inherent goodness of mankind. There was a gradual shift to the idea of land based power, aristocracies running society being replaced by the financial power of new capitalists. We also see a period here where the nobility becomes poorer in both England and America than they had been. We're seeing this change in absolute monarchy, the kind that was exemplified by King Louis XIV, with his unrestricted political sovereignty over all his subjects. Another phenomenon of this time was something called the Grand Tour. It was the trendy thing to do, de rigueur, as it was called in French, for wealthy Americans and English and Northern Europeans, both men and women, to make a cultural pilgrimage to Southern Europe, primarily Italy, to view sites of neoclassical, classical Greek, Roman, Greek classicism rather, and Roman neoclassicism paradigms of art, such as sculpture that was meant to inspire nationalism and patriotism and courage. While Fragonard's The Swing, shown here, is a classic example of the idea of Rococo during the time of the 18th century French aristocratic paintings that are emblematic of pastel colors, light brushstrokes, and aristocrats themselves as subject matter. There's a sort of saucy portraiture or lightness, flippancy sometimes, to the subject matter, the content of these images, as well as frequently pastoral settings. We also can identify the swing as a classic example of a category of that kind of painting, of Rococo painting during this time, that is called fête galante, fête galante, in which aristocrats are depicted frolicking in gardens. So it's a sort of spot on example of both of those things. The swing was commissioned by a rather notorious French, let's call him a swinger himself, or a libertine, a baron, the Baron Saint Julien, as a portrait of his mistress. And he instructed Fragonard, who was chosen after some other painters turned down this request for a commission. I should like you to paint Madame seated on a swing, being pushed by a bishop. That's not exactly what occurred here. However, Fragonard leapt to the occasion and he produced what became the most iconic work of the French Rococo style, as well as mentioned of the category of painting called fête galante. So in the foreground, we see the playboy, Baron himself depicted. He's reclining in this shrubbery, in these very sort of lushly painted bushes, one arm's outstretched towards his mistress's skirts. And some of his other very specific instructions to Fragonard were place me in a position where I can observe the legs of that charming girl. We see here Fragonard fulfilling the Baron's specifications to a T, really. His mistress is flying through the air on this swing, her shoe flying off in the heat of the moment, even we might call it, sort of giving herself away to this idea of frivolous abandon. In the background of the painting, we can see that what was originally going to be the bishop has been changed to the mistress's husband by Fragonard, the painter. The husband is playing a lesser role, while the Baron is the subject, the male subject, illuminated in a way under his mistress's dress. What else do we have in this painting? We have two cherubs below the swing that they appear somewhat involved in the, let's call them, the illicit or frivolous actions of the humans above them. One cherub is looking up at the woman in some sort of almost fear or trepidation, and the other with a bit of disapproval, an expression of disapproval on his face. On the left side of the image is a stone statue of Cupid raising a finger to his lips to point out the secret of nature of the impending affair. Well, actually, the affair that has already blossomed. So Fragonard's The Swing is quite rich with symbolism, as well as quite deftly capturing and conveying a moment of joie de vivre, or just joy of life, as joie de vivre is translated from France. And it's also reflective of this idea of this illicit affair. It's, again, highly emblematic of the idea of Rococo art. Fragonard's most successful painting considered that. Again, this insouciant attitude, this kind of tongue-in-cheek eroticism, the pastel swirls, and the tiny brushwork, the loose brushwork, is all part of this idea of conveying a notion of beauty and naughtiness, illegitimate affairs, adultery being something that was, if we can say acceptable, it was certainly not unacceptable during this time. Fragonard was taught well by one of his teachers, Francois Boucher, who was a master of the idea of the pastoral scene with a passionate sensibility. And we certainly see the way that Fragonard turns this idea of more of a boudoir scene in open air into this commissioned depiction as, again, highly representative of that. So Fragonard is painting the swing with the intention of flattering the Baron and his mistress, fulfilling the commission of showing his mistress, not being swung in the swing by the Baron as requested, but imbuing them with this very sort of light-hearted, again, joie de vivre emotionality that emanates from the painting. In terms of composition, we can also look at how the swing is composed in a triangular shape, with the Baron and husband at the base and the maiden at the top. We note the soft lighting coming from above, falling upon her. There are a few other hidden details that enhance this idea of playful love. A little stone lapdog, a dolphin, without going into detail with the others. Again, there's this insouciant accent of the mistress's shoe or slipper flying off her foot as she swings so easily. Perhaps another way of commenting upon her falling into this illicit affair, an erotic relationship. Again, in terms of technique, this very pastoral scene is infused with a very soft light filtering through the trees, a kind of backlit scene, a soft, seductive glow that highlights the fairness of the skin of his mistress, and her fabric billowing around her. The color palette, with its pinks and minty greens and almost these uh, rich cream colors. The other way of thinking, or another way of considering the husband in the shadows, more or less, could also reference his idea of the idea, rather, of his being in the dark as to this affair as depicted here. So mirth, frivolity, all very typical of Rococo works, fluid, loose brushstroke. Um, the swing was quite popular in its day, and then not so much so, as is the way with all ups and downs in the world of not just celebritydom, but art as well. As we moved into the more classical subject matter, as we will shortly in this lecture, of neoclassicist paintings such as Jacques-Louis David. In William Hogarth's The Marriage Contract, we're looking at the idea of inventing these moralizing paintings that Hogarth then turned into prints to sell as sets to the public. The Marriage Contract is from a series called Marriage à la mode, or à la mode meaning in fashion in French, fashion of marriage at the time, that promoted marriage based on love, not on what is called an arranged marriage. So the marriage contract here shows the opposite of that, a lord arranging for his son to marry the daughter of a wealthy merchant. And the nature of this betrothed couple as a couple is one that is entirely loveless. In a sense, the ambition behind Hogarth's work here ties into some of the ideas of Ruskin, a major critic at the time, who was following an ambition that was became a distinctly British style, um, and was more about social progress and the idea of art for social good. In Joseph Wright's An Experiment on a Bird in the Air Pump, we're looking at an artist who has an Enlightenment era interest in science and technology, who painted often candlelit scenes. Here we see one that looks almost like a parlor game. This painting is one that is very representative in terms of its content, its subject, its theme, of this rapid rise in technology in the period of, say, 1750 to 1800, um, and from there on. Iron as a building material during this period is radically changing the face of architecture, and we see this most dramatically in the phenomenon of the 1851 building of the Crystal Palace, and its unprecedented and large-scale use of glass and iron. What we see here in Wright's painting is air being pumped out of a large glass vessel that is above the head of the scientist. What else happens here? A traveling scientist is shown demonstrating the formation of a vacuum by withdrawing air from a flask containing a white bird, a cockatoo, although more common birds such as sparrows would more normally have been used in this kind of experiment. The air inside is collapsed and then reintroduced to the vessel. That's the function of the air pump here. Air pumps were developed in the 17th century, and so by the time Wright painted this work, they were relatively familiar. So the subject here is really more of a human drama than the nature of a scientific invention, because again, this invention is something that has become more commonplace at this time. What's the equation here? The bird will die if the demonstrator continues to deprive it of oxygen. And what Wright does here is leave us in doubt as to whether or not the cockatoo will be revived. The painting reveals a wide range of reactions from the children who appear frightened, through the sort of reflective manner of the philosopher, the excited interest of a young man, and a pair of lovers who seem more concerned with each other and rather indifferent to the tableau that's unfolding before us. We have these figures dramatically lit by a single candle. The moon appears in a window. And let's note, when we think about the idea of Vanitas painting, particularly in the Netherlands, and the area of Memento Mori, on a table in front of the candle is a glass containing a skull. In Angelica Kaufmann's Cornelia pointing to her children as her treasures, we have a phrase associated with this painting and this painter, and that is the pointing by Cornelia to her children of the idea of these are my jewels. She is the classical epitome of the good mother. She serves this mother as a prime example of the highest level of civic and moral authority, even. Kaufmann started painting early on. She actually was painting portrait commissions by the time she was 15, and then she turned to history painting, as she does here, which um, was noted at this particular period as the highest form of art in terms of subject matter. With Jacques-Louis David's paradigm, template of the neoclassical, and more than arguably his greatest work, um, and large scale at that. Also very anti Rococo in terms of its virtuous and moral behavior, um, and of course in the way that it is painted as well. Um, the oath of the Horatii, as it's commonly called. The Latin pronunciation would be the Horati, which is also acceptable. It's very much about the tail end of the Enlightenment espousing the idea that the rational should supersede the spiritual and the superstitious and the frivolous, the Rococo being rather distinctively frivolous. At this point of time, this painting, made from 1784 to 85, was exhibited in 85. Just a few years before the French Revolution. The American Revolution has already occurred. there's this prevalent idea, um, of course, still operating at that time, that women could not function as true citizens of the state, that they were solely occupied with the personal and the familial, and that civil concerns were not theirs. Um, in terms of the style of painting of those subjects here, we see the rigidity of the men and the sense of purpose, um, that these very curvilinear women do not match. The men's arms are raised in salute. These three brothers, twins actually, comprise a collective brotherhood. And the anatomy of their bodies are so specifically depicted. If we look at a calf, if we look at the musculature, this is a tragic story in that no one wins. Both sides will lose, and the marriage of the families, marriages between families of the subjects here, complicates things. When visitors to the Paris Salon in 1785, when this painting was exhibited, um, were first came upon it, they were transfixed. Again, it's a large-scale painting. It's these three brothers saluting towards three swords held up by their fathers. The women behind them grieve. No one had ever seen anything like this. Again, radically different from Rococo style that precedes it. Similar subjects had been painted and viewed, exhibited in the salon before, but the physicality and the intense emotion of this painting was fresh, new, undeniable. It changed French art. It was a revolutionary painting a few years before the revolution. Does it in any way precede the idea of the revolution? Is Jacques-Louis David here calling for a real kind of revolution? The women here know that they will bear the consequence of the battle because their two families are united by marriage. One of the wives in the painting is a daughter of the Carratti, and another is engaged to one of the Carratti brothers. At the end of the legend informing this painting, the sole surviving Heratti or Harachier brother kills Camilla, who is engaged to one of the Carratti brothers. There's a whole story behind this. Camilla condemned his murder of her beloved. Resulted in Camilla being accused of putting her sentiment, her familial sentiment, above her moral civic duty to Rome. So the very moment of this classical tale that David represents, in his own words, was, quote, the moment which must have preceded the battle when the elder Horatius, gathering his sons in their family home, makes them swear to conquer or die, end quote. How did David go about telling the story of this oath, this sacred oath? He created a very rigorously organized tableau, a painting with a scene set in what looks to be a Roman atrium. It's dominated by three arches in the back, keeps our attention focused on the main action in the foreground. We see these three young men, the Horatio brothers, framed by the first arch. They're bound together with their muscled arms raised in that rigid salute. Their fathers framed by the central arch. He holds three swords aloft in his left hand and raises his right hand, signifying promise or sacrifice. The male figures are created with these very tense geometric forms that again contrast markedly with the softly curved, the curvilinear and flowing poses of the women seated behind the father. David lit this scene with a very stark clinical light that contrasts sharply with the scene's heightened drama, as if he's asking the viewer to respond with a mixture of both passion and rationality. His painting is a classic inclusion in neoclassical art history. It tells a story directly derived from the classical world that provides an example, again, of virtuous, moral, civic behavior, of sacrifice, too. This dramatic, almost rhetorical gestures of the male figures, iconic almost, convey the idea of the sacredness of oath-taking. Another thing David does that renders this painting so as such an arresting one is the way he radically cuts off the space using the arches and pushes that action to the foreground. It's almost in the manner of Roman relief sculpture, so sculpture that is slightly raised out of, whether it's a bas relief, a low relief, or a higher one, out of its frame. The Death of Marat is a second painting by Jacques-Louis David. And in it, we have a storyline that's tantamount to a murder mystery. And I'm going to tell it to you as the kind of story that David intended to convey when he painted this and chose this theme as his subject matter. Here's the story. At 7:15 in the evening, in the year of 1793, after a run-in, kind of spat, an altercation with Marat's girlfriend, Charlotte Corday was admitted by the downstairs concierge, more or less, the building manager, to Jean-Paul Marat's room at number 30 Rue des Cordeliers. She had just bought and brought with her a large knife. She entered the room, discovered Marat in the bathtub, whose profession was that of a politician and a publicist. He's in the bath in order to relieve the pain caused by a skin disease he has. And she plants that large knife quite forcefully into the chest of Marat. Who was Corday? She was a fervent royalist who had gotten it into her head to kill Marat, who was a political agitator, who was anti-aristocracy. Since 1789, a few years previous to his murder, Marat had published a paper called L'Ami du Peuple, Friend of the People, and he was highly popular among them. The paper's policy was pretty hardline and ruthless. The propaganda opportunities that rose out of this assassination didn't go unnoticed. And so a national group requested that David immortalize Marat in a painting. David was at that time not only the most prominent French artist, he of the most perfectly classic painting of that soon-to-be time. It's going to be premiered in 2 years, The Oath of the Horatii, or Horati, which, as we now know, was his masterwork. But David was also a very close personal friend of Marat, who was the president of a political group, the Jacobins Club, and a member of the Revolutionary Counter. Both of these men had voted in favor of the death penalty for King Louis the 16th. Now, for a neoclassical artist, as we see in The Oath, what one expects are subjects and scenes that honor classical antiquity and the Roman Republic civic virtues. In this case, nothing was really further than the truth. David is placing a contemporary subject in a contemporary setting. He said, quote, "I thought it would be interesting to show him as I found him, writing for the happiness and the well-being of the people," quote unquote, David said. Recall that the name of his paper is Friend of the People. So while this idea of the classical hero it's still arguably represented here, it's in a way that's contemporary, but that doesn't in any sense trivialize Marat or his death. It's part of the reason why David chose to limit the scope here to the bare minimum of his subject, Jean Paul Marat, and bestowing upon him through that this sort of halo of a hero of the people. There's no context. The assassin's not present, no friend, no family mourners, no bedroom, no living room to place the subject into a different kind of reality. No, just as in a photograph, David is framing the context of the time in which the murder occurred. So what we see here in terms of other clues or signs depicted in this scene are just a few fragments that are now remnants of Marat's revolutionary activity, his writing implements, his altruism and public spiritedness represented through the letter he's writing, the suffering from his skin disease that he hoped the bath is going to ameliorate, and his heroic death, the bloodstained knife. These are the humble symbols that David combined to depict Marat as a generous hero who sacrifices his life in order to achieve his revolutionary ideas. When we look at Jean-Antoine's Houdon, Houdon, pronounced Houdon, representation of George Washington, then a general, later our first president of the United States, we see really a perfect representation of what the first president of the United States of America will represent. Dignity, honor, victor in the Revolutionary War. His attire is classical, although he's represented in a classical manner. And it's worth noting that with his right hand, he's holding onto what is really a mere walking stick. He is not holding a sword, not one of peace or plowing or one of war. And in his left hand, he's holding onto a bundled bunch of 13 rods that represent the country's 13 first colonies. Thomas Jefferson's impressive architectural creation, his primary plantation, meaning of course he had more than one, is a complicated building in terms of what it represents for us now in our contemporary day and age. Again, we're always hearkening back to thinking about the context of the artwork, the paintings, the sculpture, drawings, etchings, architecture that is created at the point of time that the periods of art that we're examining and learning about, and then placing our own contemporary, present day perspective upon the original author's intentions. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, our third president, founder of the University of Virginia, a man who was not just a public official, historian, philosopher, who served his country for over 50 years, but also a plantation owner, one whose lineage, in terms of his progeny, who have come to light and who have been certified, documented as his progeny, as the ancestors of a former slave who worked for him on his plantation, casts a new light on this American hero, depending, of course, on your perspective and your point of view. He was also a great cultural figure, introduced all kinds of new types and strains of agriculture, of plants, into this country, was always reading about and then ordering from wherever he could, having shipped seeds and seedlings and plants. He was at the forefront of American viticulture, with some of our earliest dedicated, not what are known as promiscuous or wild plantings. Monticello, which is a building that Jefferson began designing at the young age of 26 after he inherited land from his father as the luckier born to the Manor, or toward the Manor born members of our society, um, prominent members of not just our society socioeconomically, but of our political structure at that time, is certainly Jefferson's grandest achievement. So we can add architect to his list of accomplishments and accolades. This being a plantation, he used slaves for quite extensive cultivation of tobacco and mixed crops, the kind of crops that he was constantly investigating and attempting to upgrade. And he later shifted that tobacco cultivation to wheat in response to market changes. The property itself is a National Historic Landmark, it's a UNESCO site. How is it designed? More importantly, from an architectural perspective, neoclassical. If we think back to the Italian Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio, this is very much like Palladio's Rotondo. Jefferson reworked this kind of design throughout much of his presidency. He incorporated design elements that were popular in late 18th century Europe, and he modified them, thereby creating some of his own design approaches and solutions. How we think about what Monticello represents, again, is something that has changed over time. The classical elements in this structure, again, were somewhat common in France at that time, but definitely attributable, again, to Palladio and Palladian architecture. Palladian architecture is seen in its greatest critical mass in the Veneto region of northern Italy, not in America. So this building was even more original, unusual, and unique to its time, in that it was borrowing from the principles of this renowned neoclassical architect. You'll note that this is the second time we're looking at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, here in the context of American and British architecture at the time in its category, and then above paired with Houdon's statue of George Washington. Same image, just looking at it in two contexts.